History. It can tell you many things. The achievements, the people that rose to power, inventions, how life was like for those long gone. But history can have a dark side, something I have a notion of delving into for my own amusement. History isn't always pretty. It can be very nasty. We will be looking into torture and execution. We will be looking at the fiendish devices used on prisoners to extract information, and how historical figures met a terrible fate. Let us go down to the dungeons below, where you will hear the screams of pain and cries of anguish. Watch out for the dungeon master. The rack. The rack was first introduced in 1447 by John Holland, the Duke of Exeter. The device was a tall wooden frame with a roller on both ends. The unlucky victim will be strapped to the rack by their wrists and ankles. Then the operator in charge would turn the crank at both ends, and the chains tied to the limbs tightened and tightened. The limbs would stretch and stretch ever so slowly, causing excruciating pain. And eventually the limbs would pop right out of their sockets. In some cases, if the muscle fibers would be stretched to an extent, the limbs would be rendered useless. The Judas Chair. This was a wooden pyramid where, when the prisoner was mounted on it, they were to be left on there for days, maybe even longer. The unlucky soul was stripped of their clothing. Then they would be lowered onto the tip and sat up there and experience hours and hours of horrible pain. Get comfy. Sometimes it wasn't even the chair that killed them, rather the infections that followed. The Pear of Anguish. This was an interesting little device. It was a metal device in the shape of a pear. This would be placed within the victim's mouth, and in some other cases, other orifices. Then with the turn of the key, the pear would open into spoons, and what would follow next would come a most uncomfortable and soon to be a horribly painful ordeal the more the key turned. The Thumbscrew. This was an instrument similar to a vice, only it had either spikes or studs on the side. The victim's fingers or toes were forced in the middle. Then the torturer would turn the crank. Then slowly the vice would close in on their digits. The spikes would puncture the nails, and soon the victim's digits would be crushed down. The Brazen Bull, a horrifying invention created in ancient Greece by a man named Perilaus. The Brazen Bull was a hollow sculpture of a life-size bull made out of bronze, with a door on the side. It was designed to amuse Phalaris, the tyrant of Sicily. The victim would be locked inside the bull, and then a fire was lit beneath the bull, heating up the metal. Inside, the victim would be burned, scalded, and the hot air made it difficult to breathe. It would have been a horrifying experience. And as it got hotter, the screams would make it sound like a bull due to the acoustic effects equipped. According to legend, Phalaris was so impressed by this invention, he forced its very creator, Perilaus, to be his first victim. The Rat. This means of torture was a grisly sight. The victim was tied down to a table or any similar worktop. Then a metal cage was placed on the victim's abdomen, and inside was a live rat. The torturer would set a small fire or place hot coals at the top of the cage. This would cause the rat to find a means of escape. Not being able to escape the cage, the rat would gnaw and rip through the flesh and burrow their way out while the torture victim was alive. The Tongue Tearer. Ah, the Tongue Tearer. Picture a large, nasty-looking pair of scissors. These would be heated in a fire. Once the blades were white and hot, your tongue would be stretched out of your mouth, and the scissors would snap shut with it in between the blades. It would take about 3 snips of your tongue to be cut out of your mouth. The Wheel. Those who committed heinous crimes such as murder or unspeakable acts would be tied to the wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel or the breaking wheel, would be the size of a wagon wheel. The prisoner would be tied onto the wheel and spun around. The executioner would bludgeon the prisoner, first by striking at the limbs, and they would go for the neck or the heart. Once the prisoner's body was mangled, the wheel would be hoisted up a tall pole, and the body was left up there. The wheel slowly turning until the crows finished off the remains. A slow and painful way to go. The Iron Maiden. Proof of its use and existence is yet to be determined. Although a similar device is mentioned in ancient texts from before 200 BC, supposedly made of wood with iron spikes inside. It is said that the Iron Maiden was a tall iron cabinet large enough for a human to be trapped inside. The interior was fitted with metal spikes. The victim would be placed inside the Iron Maiden and had to stand in there for hours, days even. Some say that the spikes were on cranks so that the guard in charge could turn each spike further, inch by bloody inch, and slowly penetrate the victim's body. Any slight movement from within the maiden would be pure agony. The Heretics Fork. This fiendish instrument was used during the Spanish Inquisition. The fork was double-ended and held by a leather strap. This would be tied onto the victim's neck, with one end of the fork under the chin, the other end on the breastbone. Any slight movement would cause the fork to pierce and penetrate the flesh. Always kept the victim's head tilted back. This fork was not designed to kill, but to cause excruciating pain for the victim. Even if it didn't cause any pain during the long period of time, trying to avoid inflicting pain among themselves, this would drive them into madness. Chappy Chopper. Another interesting and fiendish instrument. It was designed similar to a pair of bolt cutters. I bet some of you can already tell where this is going. Those who were equipped with testicles would have their legs spread and held open. And then, the screams that come after the chopper has done its work. It's a sight to behold, and the agonizing screams are music to the torturer's ears. The Breast Ripper. The Breast Ripper. These were designed like tongs with claws at the end. Nasty looking instrument. These were heated over a fire, and once it was white and hot, these would be attached onto the woman's breasts and feel searing pain at first, before the claws opened up and ripped the breasts off the body. Boiling. Simple, yet very effective. This means of torture was used a lot during the 16th century, particularly during the reign of King Henry VIII. A large vat of water, or if the torture was feeling creative, a vat of molten iron. The victim would be lowered into the vat very, very slowly, and then the victim would endure horrible pain as their body was lowered into the boiling hot liquid, screaming in agony until they got a confession or information out of the victim. Fancy a dip? Iron combs. The iron combs, these were originally used as tools for wool and other fibres. But when the torturers got a hold of them, they saw it as a brutal torture tool. This method of torture was used on victims with religious beliefs. Brandishing iron combs, the sharp blades would be brushed into the flesh of the victims, slowly and painfully. They'd continue until the prisoner would renounce their faiths and beliefs. This would result in flaying if continued, and eventually death. Judicial drowning. This was a slow and horrible form of punishment. Those sentenced to judicial drowning were chained by their wrists during low tide of the river. The victim was left there as the tide came in. The water would eventually rise until the victim couldn't reach the surface for air, and soon they would drown in the deep, cold water. Whatever was left of the body were left for the rats to finish them up. The Bloody Gull. This was more of a form of execution than a means of torture. This was a grisly ritual conducted by the Vikings. It was used for traitors, and during the Viking invasion of Britain, they used on Christian prisoners. There were two ways of performing the Bloody Gull. One way the ritual was performed was the traitor was hung up in a prone position. They took a sharp tool out and severed the spine. Next, the Viking would reach into the opening and pulled the lungs out, and they were hung like a pair of wings. The alternative method was that the Viking would tie the victim to a stake. Then he would slit the victim open with the sharp tool from armpits to waist. Then the front of the body was split open, and the Viking would reach in for the ribs and spread them open like a pair of bloody wings. Finally, the heart and lungs were removed and nailed above the body as an offering to their god Odin. Drawing and quartering. This was a brutal form of capital punishment used during medieval times to early modern Britain and Ireland. It was given to those found guilty of high treason. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators were all sentenced to this horrible punishment. It began by the victim having their feet tied to either a hurdle or wooden frame, and then it be dragged by a horse on their way to the place of execution. When they arrived, the traitor would be hanged up, then they'd have their genitals removed and burned in a fire before their very eyes. That is if the traitor had male genitals, of course. Then, the traitor would have their internal organs removed also, and eventually be drawn and quartered. Their remains would be displayed in public as a warning to those who dare to go against the crown. The Chair of Torture. The Chair of Torture may be the worst experience any victim can experience. This was a sinister chair made of iron. There were spikes placed everywhere, all down the back, at the base, and the armrests. The victim was forced into the chair and tied down by their wrists and ankles. Excruciating pain would follow. Then the chair would be moved close to the open flames, and the chair would get hotter and hotter. The screams from the victim would echo around the room, This was demonstrated to other prisoners to break their spirits and hopefully give the executioners the information they want. Would you like a seat? Now, let us share a couple of grisly tales of infamous executions in history. Thomas Beckett. In 1170, the Church and the Crown had been quarrelling among each other. Where King Henry II desired to rule England as a secular dominion, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Beckett, insisted on a combined leadership by the Church and State. It got to a point where the king had had enough of the Archbishop. On December 29th of that year, the king ordered 4 of his knights to eliminate the Archbishop. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral and burst through the doors. There they found Thomas Beckett kneeling at the altar in prayer. One of the knights raised their sword and struck a blow to the Archbishop's head several times. It was the final blow that split his head open, spilling his blood at the altar steps. To this day, the bloodstains have remained there. Saint George, the patron saint of England, he was captured and tortured for his Christian beliefs. History will tell you that many people executed for their beliefs, refusing to renounce his faith. Saint George was tied to a cross. Then he had his flesh scraped by iron combs. After this, he was placed on a table where he was nailed and chained to. It didn't end there. He was poisoned, placed between 2 wheels with spikes, boiled alive in molten lead, and finally beheaded. Ridley and Latimer. Oxford, October 16th, 1555. During the reign of Queen Mary, Bishops Ridley and Latimer were executed for alleged heresy and for their Protestant beliefs. By order of the Queen, they were to be burned at the stake with sacks of gunpowder around their necks. As they lit the fires, Latimer spoke to Ridley. "We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Latimer died instantly. As for Ridley, he cried, "I cannot burn!" It was a slow and horrific demise. Saint Margaret Clitherow. York, 1586. Saint Margaret Clitherow was executed for harbouring Catholic priests. Catholicism was frowned upon this time. They were either imprisoned or executed. When they found Saint Margaret with Catholic priests in her home, she was arrested. Her punishment was to be crushed alive. She was taken to Ousegate Bridge, and they laid her on the road with a rock the size of a fist beneath her back. Then they took the front door of her house and laid it down on top of her, soon to be weighed down by heavy rocks. For 15 minutes, She endured excruciating pain as more rocks were placed on top of the door she laid underneath of. Soon, she died and was left there for hours. She was secretly buried by Catholic rites, and her hand was preserved. It currently resides at the Bar Convent Museum. Well now, I hope you enjoyed these dark and grisly tales of torture and execution which were used over the centuries. You can see how far we've come over the generations. These means of torture and execution are long gone, abolished by law. Just as long as history does not repeat itself.